This is the London Fintech Podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman, and this is London Fintech Podcast, episode 22. And I'm delighted to be joined on the show today by Dave Birch of Consult Hyperion to discuss a 30,000 feet overview of payments in the fintech age. Having done a few alternative finance shows recently, it's important to recall that there is another hardcore fintech sector that's already changing the world, as opposed to threatening to in the future. This is payments. 1/4 of the fintech 50 are payments companies. When I looked a little while ago, there were well over 1,000 on Angelslist. So we definitely need a super sherpa to guide us through this maze. Consult Hyperion are an independent technical and strategic consultancy that specialise in secure electronic transactions. For 2 decades, they've been working with technologies ranging from smart cards and mobile phones to contactless tickets and electronic ID in mass market systems that include global payments, national and regional ticketing, international settlement, national identity, and corporate services. So I think they might know a bit. Dave, besides being a member of the Amalgamated Union of Wheel Tappers, Shunters and Podcasters, bang goes the other half of my audience that I didn't lose to Peter Renton in LFP022, was a founding director of Consult Hyperion and is now their global ambassador. I'll ask him later what that means, but that sounds like my kind of job. All status, privilege, and no real work. He wears a whole host of battle honours on his uniform. To quote a few, described by the Telegraph as one of the world's leading experts on digital money, by The Independent as a grade A geek, and by the Centre of Study of Financial Innovation as one of the most user-friendly of the UK's Uber techies. Named in Wired magazine's global top 15 sources of business information, voted one of European Power 50 people in digital financial services. He also runs a very recommendable unconference the day before Finovate. So once again, I've made the mistake of inviting someone on the show who really knows what he's talking about. Great for you listeners, and great for my therapist revenues perhaps. As for me, perhaps I'll just hum along in the background. Anyway, I'm looking forward to learning more, as payments is something that I, like most of you perhaps, have never bothered to find too much out about. This is probably why it has remained an unsexy and expensive area in FS until recently, when fintechs around the world exploded into action. So let's get on with the show. Hi Dave, thanks for joining me on the show today.
Not at all, Mike. Thanks very much for inviting me.
So Dave, do you want to start with how we first met surrounded by naked people of whom you were taking photos, or with what the gilded life of a global ambassador is like? And not, of course, that either of these are leading questions.
It's true, but I think if I relate the story of naked people hanging around the Royal Exchange, the podcast might get banned in several countries.
They were all painted in many colours, actually.
We should put that to one side.
It was at the Royal Exchange, and actually there is a fintech angle. It was very, very cold, I think, in January. So cold that it was unfortunate for the gentlemen and prominent for the ladies, shall we say. And it was an advert for TransferWise.
Yeah, I never really understood what the advert was. Anyway, it doesn't matter, but the point is...
Nothing to hide.
Anybody that advertises using naked people, I automatically start using their products. I'm a satisfied TransferWise customer.
Oh, I see. So it's definitely a Marmite ad, because anybody that does that, then you use them. But I'm vice versa, anyone that resorts to such things. And having been there, it was actually kind of... Well, it wasn't erotic, actually. Seeing naked ladies painted all sorts of colours strangely. Useful consumer advice for people out there. But actually, I felt a rather sort of pity for these people, because they were absolutely freezing to death. So what TransferWise is really doing is freezing people to death just to get more clients. One way of customer acquisition, I guess. Right, so moving on from naked painted people. So what is it like, sort of, being a viceroy, or whatever your business card says?
It's a funny idea. But so the idea is, I'm essentially external business development. So I spend my time going around talking to clients and, talking to the wider marketplace, listening to what's going on, observing the trends. And it started off as a bit of a joke, but ambassador is quite a funny name for it, so we sort of stuck with it.
It's better than external business development.
Exactly. But the crucial point about it is I spend most of my time outside the company talking to clients and finding out what they want. So consequently, I have a reasonable perspective on the market as a whole. I guess that's the point.
And I think that's very interesting because obviously the tech scene and fintech scene is very obsessed with all these startups and the new companies going. And some 20 years ago, you guys were a startup. And 20 years later, you've been through the whole process of startup, scale up, and now mature company. And I was interested in seeing your website. Actually, how many of the original folks are still around, as a sort of a community of you. And going back to basics, one of the basics that I think fintech does very well compared to, say, existing financial services players, is this client contact and really knowing what's going on out there. So it's really cool that you're still out there after 20 years.
We remain a technology-focused consultancy, so our work, by and large, is about helping players in the fintech space to make more money, let's not be too crude about it, using new technology. So you have to look at the technology roadmap and you have to understand what's coming around the corner. But I'm sure, as everybody tells you, that the technology by itself isn't enough. You have to understand other trends as well to see where it can fit in. And that's why being out and about, frankly, is sort of the fun part of the job.
Yes, it's also actually, those listeners who do it, as they all know, it's actually harder work than it sounds being out and about all the time. Sometimes it's just easier to sit in the office.
That's true.
So moving on to payments, as I say, I think there are well over 1,000 startups or 1,500 payment startups on Angelslist last summer when I looked, or something like that. An incredible number. So let's just start with the super big picture on that. Why are there thousands of payment startups?
I have a sort of fairly stock answer to this, Mike, which I don't want to sound too sort of cliched, but when I first got into payments, quite a long time ago now, broadly speaking, there were 3 complaints about the payments sector, which essentially were that payments were too expensive, too slow, and too opaque. And the truth is, it took a long time for any movement to happen on any of those kind of things. But essentially, it's still true. And so as a consequence, the payments industry can be attacked across all 3 of those axes. Why is it all happening now? Actually, that's a combination of 2 things. That's a combination of the technological platform, because the internet and mobile phones and smart cards and all these kind of things are putting new technologies into the field which allow people cost-effective access to the levels of security that you need to run a payments network, and that's democratized that sort of thing. So it's much easier to set up a payment system now. But the other thing is regulation, and we shouldn't underplay the role of regulation. The Commission has consistently over the last few years tried to regulate payments away from banking. So in other words, you have the Payment Services Directive, you have all of these licensing regimes, payment institutions, electronic money licensing, this kind of stuff.
The new payments regulator.
And the new payments regulator has innovation actually as part of her very specific
It's
role.
An economic regulator, which is relatively unique for the city as a focus. I went to a meeting with her last year, and I think her background was something like, the electricity regulation or something like that, where they're very much focused on competition.
Exactly. So from my point of view, we have lots of exciting new technologies to play with, but actually it's a regulatory context which has brought a lot of that alive. Now, I think it's reasonable to observe that the new entrants aren't all focused on cost. So a while back, if you were going to come into this space, payments is a mass market business. If I wanted to go to Tesco with a new payments proposition, it would have to be something that would make a pretty significant dent in their costs. Otherwise, it's not worth them investing in the systems and the new terminals and all that sort of thing. But that's changed a little bit. So you have a lot of fintech entrants now that are doing clever stuff with the data, making it more convenient for consumers, adding transparency, reporting, auditing. There's a whole section of that market which is to do with essentially facilitating the sharing economy and linking payments with social networks and that kind of thing. So there's exciting new areas for these fintech startups to go into around payments as well.
So the motivation has started with we do it cheaper, and this has moved on to we do it better. Is that roughly right?
And we add more value. So I think if you talk to a lot of people in this space at the moment, they'll say, look, we live in a world, if you're talking about retail-facing consumer payments, we live in a world where essentially the fee revenue is asymptotic to 0. So any realistic long-term roadmap around this space says because of regulatory pressures, increasing competition, the amount of money you can earn as a fee for doing a payment is going down, 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 down.
Just pressing pause on that one. So how rapidly is that taking place? Because again, I say I don't know much about it, but credit cards have been around for quite some time. They've got this monopoly/oligopoly. There ain't many of them. And their rates, as far as I know, have remained pretty steady. And then even the new entrants like Stripe charge, 2.9% or something like that. And PayPal, of course, has been charging quite some fees for some time as well. So it hasn't exactly got to basis points yet.
No, but the competition in that space is driving it down. In Europe, the European Commission is they call it the 2030 scheme, so debit interchange is limited to 0.2%, credit interchange is limited to 0.3%.
So just can you explain those phrases for those of us who don't live in payment? Debit interchange.
By the way, this is mad. I have to say, I don't agree with it at all. But the Commission is regulating the price that the banks are allowed to charge, what they call the interchange fee, for using credit and debit cards.
So what is an interchange fee? If I go to Tesco's with my credit card and I pay for my shopping, has that got an interchange fee?
Well, if you walk it through on cards, you go to Tesco, you put your card in, you pay for your shopping. That transaction goes to Tesco's acquirer, which I think is WorldPay. WorldPay charge Tesco X pence for it. The transaction then goes back to my bank. Let's say I'm with Barclays.
Oh, you'll pay for my shopping. This is very good, actually.
The transaction goes back to Barclays, and Barclays charge an interchange fee of X pence to WorldPay. So the Commission is regulating those fees and regulating them down. But they would be going down anyway because of competition. Yeah. And I'll give you a very simple example, which is if you look at the components of those fees. So if you say to a bank, why do you charge X to Tesco for a transaction? There are various components, running the system, managing fraud and all this kind of thing. Well, because of the migration to chip and pin, face-to-face fraud has gone down a lot. Card not present fraud actually has gone up as it happens. Now you've got Apple Pay coming along, which is going to reduce card not present fraud. So those costs go down anyway, and because of the competitive nature of the market, those do get passed on. I'm not as negative about this as the Commission is. So for a variety of regulatory and competitive reasons, the fee income is going to go down, whichever way you cut it. So you have to look at how you're going to earn money from value-added services. And one of the great untapped ways, I think, and so do other people, is actually using the data more intelligently. If you could collect more data around the payment transactions and use it intelligently, you could add value in a number of different ways. So that's the focus of quite a lot of effort at the moment.
Right, and then just keeping it very, very simple. So going back to the credit card stuff, back in the day when I first acquired a credit card, I understood that when I go into a shop, the shop pays quite a lot to be able to use Visa or MasterCard or whatever.
Well, I wouldn't be drawn on whether it's quite a lot or not.
But off the top of my head, 30 years ago when I first had a credit card, I thought it was like 5% or something.
I think the fees for what they do are pretty reasonable. And I think the solution, if you don't think they're reasonable, the solution is not regulation, but more competition. So I would, as with the UK regulator's position, if I think that payments are too expensive, then my first reaction is to increase competition, not to try and start regulating what the price should be. It would be ludicrous if the regulator went to Tesco and said this is what the price of a loaf of bread should be. So why they should be able to go to Barclaycard and say this is what interchange should be, I don't quite understand. Don't get me on that hobby horse.
Keep you going for a while, not being familiar with it. I presume that the logic goes along the lines that there is a small oligopoly, just like in mobile phone bills. And in mobile phones, the competition hasn't been as competitive as it used to be in the past. And just again, from my consumer experience, most of the times my mobile phone fees have been cut or within Europe or something is because the EC came out and says you can't charge somebody £1 a minute to call from Paris to London anymore, that kind of thing. So I assume they've got into the mentality that there are a few oligopolies going around where the market doesn't set the price.
For a variety of dreary reasons, I don't think those examples are directly comparable, but I do accept the basic point, which is that 15, 20 years ago, you had 2 or 3 main providers. I mean, you wouldn't even remember this, but there used to be another Europay in Europe as well, which the banks were never going to invest in to grow it. Yes, there were sort of 2 or 3 players, and the cost of becoming a new player was vast because you've got to go and update all the terminals. But, technology is really changing that.
Just pressing pause on that, so I always regard, some amateur perspective, that sort of the credit cards as being sort of the heart of the thing. And there are these handful, you can go anywhere in the world and use them. And actually a small handful, given my experiences in the past with Amex on business. So my guess would be that if I wanted to go and set up a, quotes, new credit card, just keeping it very basic in layman's terms, that the cost of entry would be virtually infinite, wouldn't it?
To set up a new credit card. And your costs are all really advertising and marketing, and there's umpteen companies you can go to get the cards made and distributed.
Yeah, but to create a global brand that isn't Visa or MasterCard, that Mike Pay or something like that,
Well, I don't think that's the trend.
No, I know it's not the trend, but this is my point.
When I come on to my key trends in a moment, I'll explain why that is. But just to illustrate, I'm just going to give you one case study in microcosm, just because I read it on the train coming in today. Ladbrokes have just shut 80 betting shops, I think, and they're just about to shut another 80 betting shops. So Ladbrokes are closing betting shops. Why is this? Because people don't go to betting shops anymore, they use the app on their phone. Now, if I go to your betting shop and I want your betting shop to take a new payment mechanism, and you've got to upgrade your terminals or install some new equipment and you've got to train staff and blah, 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 that's quite a barrier to entry. If I want your Ladbrokes app to take a new payment mechanism, that's nothing. And if it's a niche that only 10% of the market want that payment mechanism, fine, it doesn't matter. So I can come to you and say, hey, why don't you, as they inevitably will, I'm sure, why doesn't your Ladbrokes app use Apple Pay or Venmo or Payem or Ping It or any one of the other things that's going on? That's a very different proposition from coming and saying, why doesn't your chain of shops take my new credit card?
Right, okay, so there's a good answer. So what you're basically pointing out is that my thinking is stuck in this old thing, not surprising because I've used this for decades, as most people have, in that I think of going to a shop and I pay with generally credit card or cash and very rarely I pay with debit card. But what you're pointing out is that there's new sexy ways. So do you want to tell us about the new sexy ways?
You know, when you asked me to sort of pop in to have a quick chat, I was thinking, well, what are the things that we're telling our clients about to keep an eye out for? What are the things you should be looking out the corner of your eye to see where the trends are going? You know, where should we be investing for the future? And I picked out 5. And I'll just very quickly run through those, and I think that will give your listeners the sort of picture. The first one is precisely this transition to in-app payments. If you look at markets where in-app payments have been offered, you know, a general basis, I mean, Korea is an example to look at, what you see is people move to in-app payments very quickly.
And just to be clear, an in-app payment is something like I've got a Starbucks, I don't have a Starbucks app, but if I had, I could pay them somehow.
Exactly. And I think those have more general application. You can see a vision of the future where I have a Tesco app on my phone and I pay using my Tesco app. The payment is buried, hidden away inside my Tesco app. And it doesn't matter whether I'm in Tesco or looking at the Tesco website or phoning up a Tesco call centre. It won't make any difference. When it comes to pay, my Tesco app will pop up and I'll put my finger on it or punch in a pin or something like that and it will all get sorted. So I think in-app is a really, I would have thought, you know, for most of our clients, looking at in-app is a really important thing. It's a distracting point, but it's just to say, I think some of the press comment I read on Apple Pay hasn't fully taken on board the revolutionary impact in that space. Because Apple Pay allows you to do in-app transactions with the same rules and rates, with the same degree of security as a chip and pin transaction in a store. Remember, card not present transaction fraud is rampant.
Card not present means what? Generally when I go to Tesco's, well actually I go to Waitrose, they ask me for my card.
You know, it's when you're typing your card number into a website instead of using your chip and pin card. So what Apple Pay does is bring that chip and pin level of security to online transactions. And that means when I use my Tesco app or my Uber app or my Halo app, and it uses Apple Pay, or soon to be Google Pay and these other things as well, the levels of security are very high and the convenience factor is there as well. So my first one is, I think in-app is set for really interesting growth.
And so just going back to me as a consumer, that bypasses my credit card companies. That doesn't go through my credit card bill, or it does.
That's a very interesting point, because at the moment, a lot of those things do go through your credit card companies. So, you know, I parked at the station this morning using Ringo. That, actually I can't remember which card that goes through. I think it's my John Lewis MasterCard, I might be wrong. But when I pay using Ringo at the car park, I pay using my app, the money gets sent through my credit card. But I think that's an interim. They're doing that because the credit card system's there and it works. But I'm sure it won't be very long before merchants come to you with other propositions and say, actually, for example, in Europe, because of the European Commission's push for open banking APIs, in Europe, I'm sure it won't be that long before, you know, you'll get a message saying, actually, why don't I just take the money straight from your bank account? Why bother all these other people? Yeah. Oh, and by the way, if you let me take the money from your bank account, I'll give you, you know, double loyalty points or a free coffee.
Yeah, and then there's a shorter chain of money going from A to B to C to D to E to F.
Yes,
it can be cheaper.
There's some disintermediation, but there's also the opportunity for new players in that space, I think. So in-app is the first one. The second one I've got is what I've rather clumsily labelled relocalization.
Okay, and so in English that means?
In English that means the pressure for global solutions which exists in the physical world doesn't exist in the virtual world, and in particular it doesn't exist in the mobile world. So right now I have in my bag, right now I've got my trusty American Express card, and one of the reasons why I value that card is just to give you a window into the life of a global ambassador. 2 weeks ago I was in El Salvador, and last week I was in New York.
I thought it was glamorous.
And I expect to get off the plane in any of those places and my American Express card to work perfectly in the first shop I walk into. In the mobile world it's a little bit different. So if I've got my Tesco app and my Waitrose app, you know, you could imagine a tourist gets off the plane at Heathrow and they download their London app, right? Yeah. And their London app connects to their US bank account or credit card or whatever, I don't even know, Venmo, who cares? And they go round using their London app to pay for things. And then when they get off the plane in Berlin, they have to download their Berlin app and they use that.
Isn't it a pain in the derriere?
I don't think it is.
There's lazy people like me. So, for example, I'm not a good example, but I don't have any of these store cards. I'm always queuing behind someone who's got a sort of whole wad full of hundreds of them and they sort of shuffle through.
I don't have any store cards either, except Waitrose, obviously.
But it's slightly like the electronic version.
I think the point is, having 100 different cards in your wallet is mad. Having 100 different apps on your phone isn't.
And you're not, by the way, defining mad as what your behaviour is, are you?
Yes, it does mark me out slightly. So, if I go to Australia a couple of times a year, if I get off the plane in Australia and I have to download an Australia app to pay using Australia Pay while I'm in Australia and it's linked to I don't care.
Okay,
it's
so
not
I don't care about that, but what I'm worried about is I go to Australia, whatever the equivalent of Tesco's and blah-de-blah is, I go to Australia and have to download 100 apps to go to all these places and pay.
No, well, I'm sure, Tesco will continue to take general means of payment as well as their in-app solutions. And actually, if you analyse the spending patterns in somewhere like the UK, actually, it isn't that many apps. I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, but for the average family, I think 80% of disposable spending goes to 4 shops or something. So like in our household, if we've got a Waitrose app, a Co-op app, a Shell petrol station app, and a Martins the Newsagents app, that's 80% of our weekly spending right there.
That's really interesting. Well, again, came back to your...
You don't need millions of apps.
Come back to your unconference, a couple of things stuck in my mind. One of which, just to undermine the whole theme of the show, perhaps, was that most people who hadn't paid online paid in cash rather than any sort of clever solution.
That was funny. And that was a lesson in its own right.
Exactly. So the sort of the notes in the pocket are always useful. And then sort of slightly against that trend, and I think you were one of these people that I regarded as rather strange and I hadn't really heard of, which is a whole bunch of folks, and this was a kind of paymentsy thing, so you might expect these kind of early adopters, the whole bunch of folks who wander around London without cash in their pocket, something I'd never imagined. If I sort of got no cash in my pocket, I'd go back home and put some in the pocket before going to town. But that means I'm just I'm a late adopter.
No, I come to London all the time with no... And in fact, I have come to London forgetting my wallet as well, because the only place I actually need my wallet... I mean, I can navigate around London all day just using my phone, because I've got my Barclaycard sticker on the back of the phone that gets me on the bus and tube. I've got my Starbucks app, so I can always get something to eat. And I can do fine with just my phone, except bloody South West trains. Right. I've got to use a card to pay at South West trains, which is a pain in the arse. Well,
at least you don't come through London Bridge on South West trains, though, do you? Which is a benefit in itself. Okay, so then on that point, then it's quite interesting. So there is, given that technology is changing, there are all these sort of thousands of startups out there. There are pathways which are easier, more convenient for people, but there is quite an information gap. So, for example, just picking up the contactless and Oyster Card and London Underground and all that, I'm sure if I actually had the time to sort of sit down and read it, I might actually use it. But like everybody, I'm just so overloaded with stuff, I don't have the time to educate myself about that. Well, so there's been an information gap, isn't there, or education gap?
Well, thanks for mentioning that, because actually, I'm sure you don't know this, but actually, Consult Hyperion were the consultants to TfL for that migration to Open Loop project. Right. So we've spent the best part of the last 5 years working on that project for them. It's a fantastically ambitious project.
And it seems to work very well.
And it works, yes. I have met an American friend of mine the other day, and we were having a coffee, and then we were off to the tube. He said, "Oh, I've got to stop and get a ticket." And I said, "You don't anymore." And he took out his contactless American Express card and bang, jumped on the tube, no problem at all. So actually that project works rather well. So thank you for mentioning it.
So it was fortuitous, because I didn't realise, although you control most of the things in the world behind the scenes. Going back to the information gap, it's just as simple as I haven't been by my bank sent a contactless card, and if I had, I could use that instead of the Oyster, and actually there's nothing I need to learn very much.
It's way outside the scope of the podcast, but the relationship between contactless use and transit is really very fascinating, because a lot of people had contactless cards, which they just couldn't be bothered to do anything with. Once you've forgotten your Oyster card for the day, wait a minute, I remember I can use my bank card now, can't I? So you use your bank card and you tap and get on the bus or the tube and it all works okay. Then actually your predilection to tap in other places goes up. So the relationship between transit and contactless is really rather interesting.
Yeah, it's a sort of gateway drug, as it were.
Yeah.
Into this whole going cashless. So the trends are the in-app that we discussed, the relocalization, so that's the move away from having like one card that you take everywhere in the world to going and getting more local appy solutions. That was the second.
Yes, so relocalization I think means a couple of things. It means this move away from global solutions. There's also this bigger picture around relocalization where you see regional and national schemes coming back again. So, for example, you have China Union Pay, Russia talking about starting its own debit scheme, India, Brazil, you have Edo and others. And it seems to me that the technology that lowers the barriers for fintech competitors to come in also lowers the barriers at this higher level. So many, many years ago, we used to have national schemes, Switch in the UK, for example, and we got rid of them when we went to the international schemes. And now you see national and regional solutions coming back again. And I suspect, the international schemes will remain a bridge between those kind of things. But I think it's a racing certainty that you will see more countries in the not too distant future creating their own national payment schemes again.
Oh, that's fascinating, and we don't want to go too far off piece, but I would imagine there's also a bit of a political element in that the penny only dropped with me whenever it was a few years ago, when WikiLeaks was suddenly made non-kosher. And it suddenly found that actually nobody could get any money because all the payment systems were American. And given what we've been reading about the NSA and Citizen Forward, yardy, there is a kind of regional principle, especially if I was in Russia or in China, I wouldn't be buying too many Microsoft computers, not just to pick on them.
It would be naive to pretend there isn't a political component to it. But my point is it's enabled by technological change. So, for example, Ecuador has started its own national payment scheme now. So what they've done is they've done something like M-Pesa in Kenya, except every citizen has an account and every citizen can use their phone to send money from one account to another. So you see the new technology, yes, there are some political components, but it all adds up to tectonic change.
No, massive. And I think the other thing, going back to the fact that you've been working for a while, as have I, which is that there's a certain inversion going on here. So 30 years ago, we would have probably not blinked too much talking about the third world, whereas these days, some of the so-called first world is the third world in terms of getting ahead of the curve on these things.
No, that's true, but particularly because of mobile technology.
We've talked about in-app and we've talked about relocalization.
The third area is privacy. So I think that, I'm not sure I can prove this to you with a bar chart or a spreadsheet or whatever, but the issue of privacy has been rising up the agenda recently. It really used to only be obsessives and nerds like me who thought that privacy was interesting. The public didn't really much care about it, but I think there's been a bit of a sea change in that over the last few months. And I think for some of our clients, I mean, bear in mind, we don't really work for startups. I mean, our clients are the larger end of the scale, the schemes and the banks and the telcos and so on. I think we've got to the point where they're going to have to look at making privacy an upfront part of the consumer proposition in their products, rather than having it as a sort of back office hygiene factor. And of course, you've got this other pressure as well, because you've got things like Bitcoin out there and all this sort of thing saying, well, we don't want people spying on us. And it's all not true, by the way. But at that point, could my bank, could my phone company, could they come back to me with a payment proposition which says, actually, we're going to add a privacy layer to what you do. So, to give you a silly example, why not give me a debit card that says I'm John Doe, right? I'm using my chip and PIN card. The bank knows who I am. It's nothing to do with the shop. If the shop wants to know who I am, they can give me a loyalty card or something.
Yeah, isn't that effectively the same as what you do by getting a prepaid card?
Well, except due to absurd, overblown ATF, AML, KYC, CDD rules, getting a prepaid card is equally... I did it the other day. I had to go, just to fill you in on the life of a global ambassador, when I went down to New Zealand last time, I happened to be at the airport and I thought, oh, I'll get a prepaid card with some New Zealand dollars on it, just in case, because of the ridiculous foreign currency conversion charges you pay on credit cards. And it was stimulating. I just happened to see an advert at the airport, get our... I want to say Thomas Cook, but it might not be, and I don't want to unfairly malign them.
Whoever.
Whoever has that booth at the airport, get our prepaid MasterCard and you can load New Zealand dollars onto it. And I thought, well, okay, I'll do that. What a palaver.
Really?
They've got to take photocopies of your passport, fill out this form.
I blame Gordon Brown, actually. I mean, he brought all this kind of stuff in. And the thing that really does my head in is it's a nightmare for everybody in the world. It's like sort of airport security and that. But actually, the real terrorists and all the spy agencies and all those kind of stuff manage to funnel money without a problem.
No, of course.
It's all show. It's all show.
It only inconveniences normal people like me.
Using the word normal in its loosest sense.
I mean private in a stronger cryptographic sense. So the idea that I could go around buying things privately, nobody would know who I am, nobody could track or trace or monitor me.
This is why people use cash when they come to your conference.
Not quite, because of course the bank knows who I am. Imagine I've got my blank stealth debit card. Yeah. And I use it to go and buy rice in or something. Well, when the police go around to Barclays and say, well, who does that debit card belong to? Barclays will tell them it's Dave Birch. I can't get away with anything with it, but it means I can't be monitored. And also because, you don't want to be colluded by different service providers colluding together. So I think the idea of privacy as a distinct element of the proposition, I think, is on the way back.
So it's certainly a differentiator, isn't it?
Yes, and I think as an industry, we have to respond and provide something like that. Because otherwise, the niches where people may feel uncomfortable, I have to say, by the way, there is no evidence that this is true, but the niches where people may feel uncomfortable about using their cards that have their full name and personal details, gambling and porn and things like that, we want those to remain under control and managed and monitored. And so the thing to do from an industry is to provide a solution for those spaces, not, cut them off so they all go off and use Bitcoin instead.
Indeed. Well, I mean, on the privacy and the Bitcoin thing, I mean, the thing that annoys me, one of the biggest hypocrisies going on all this kind of stuff is all these things that fund terrorism and, or fund paedophiles or whatever the scare story of the week is that it's all complete hypocrisy, because you can go anywhere in the world with $1,000 in your pocket and buy what you like, terrorist or otherwise. So that is the currency of all terrorism around the world.
As we saw on Panorama last week, at the same time, the guy at Heathrow Airport is pestering me to death, and I'm wasting half an hour in order to get a card with 100 New Zealand dollars on it. There are people walking into branches of banks in Switzerland and walking out with 5 million euros in suitcases.
Right. I didn't know they actually included you in Panorama last week, along with Stuart Gulliver.
It's a problem. But no, I think we should look at ways to offer privacy, because we don't want people to use anonymity, and we certainly don't want them to use cash.
And just pressing pause there, so you differentiate between privacy and anonymity?
Very strongly, yeah.
Okay, so a dumbo like me, to whom the words are very close in the dictionary.
Well, privacy is a kind of conditional anonymity, so, your transactions are private.
So you can't see my credit card transactions,
But if you do something
for example,
wrong, or there's some suspicion on you, or the police need to get a warrant, then I can see your transactions. Anonymous means anonymous. It means anonymous is cash, right? So the people who are smuggling money into Syria to buy weapons for ISIS at the moment aren't using prepaid cards, mobile phone top-ups, whatever. They're stuffing their knickers with 500 euro notes.
Yeah.
I think that's a bad thing. I don't want to live in a society with anonymous transactions.
Okay, well, that's a useful one, because I never really sort of bothered to think through the detail of that. The fourth point?
Well, that leads on from this point about anonymity, and the subject of Bitcoin wandered across the conversation at that point. And I'm one of the people who is unconvinced about the viability of Bitcoin as a currency. In fact, I'm unconvinced that Bitcoin is a currency at all. But I do subscribe to the notion that the technology that's underlying Bitcoin, the blockchain, the distributed public ledger that's protected by cryptography, is actually a really interesting technological breakthrough. There really is something revolutionary about maintaining a ledger that's maintained by distributed consensus and not by a central body.
And also distributed consensus of people who don't necessarily trust individually.
Correct.
That's a huge leap forward. We covered that one in LFP023 with Dr. James Smith of Elliptic in terms of how the whole distributed ledger thing works. And I've changed my views a little bit this year on Bitcoin, and one of the things that I find really annoying is that nobody uses the phrase digital currencies. Everyone talks about Bitcoin, which is one single example.
It's one way of doing it.
It's one way of doing it. There are many other ways, and I think the long-term potential of digital currencies, this is my view, my long-term potential of digital currencies is strong. The potential of Bitcoin, that's been shown as a protocol to have a number of failures. I think if it wasn't for $600 million of VC money, which is what's gone into Bitcoin, buying a hell of a lot of press coverage, it would have disappeared already. I mean, I tweeted earlier the year a fantastic picture which showed what the correlation between the Bitcoin price was and the number of media articles.
I mean, I agree with your general thrust, but I think a lot of that VC money isn't really going into Bitcoin, it's going into blockchain. And in fact, I put the statement a little bit further for the purposes of discussion and debate. I might go a little bit further. I might say, actually, payments might well be seen in the great sweep of history to be the least interesting thing you can do with a blockchain.
No, absolutely.
It's really not optimised for retail payments.
I love it. And my favourite example is always the UK property chain, having sort of once or twice made a mistake of moving house in the UK, and what a nightmare that is.
Yeah, exactly.
Stuck in something. And if it was all on some ledger, blah, 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 some clever app goes, oh, we'll move these 57 people around and actually everyone can move tomorrow. So I definitely agree there's lots of benefits.
And I think for some financial services industries, I mean, I think things like insurance and things that I don't really know about, I can see that the blockchain actually might well be more revolutionary in those spaces than in payments.
But again, the blockchain perhaps with a twist, and not in a Bitcoin sense, and it was your podcast, Dave, that turned me on to this. There was that chap, whose name escapes me, who was the economist from Oxford on your show.
Jonathan Levin.
Jonathan Levin, that's the guy. And he was talking about the cost of the electricity to run the blockchain at the moment. So everybody talks about blockchain. Too many people talk about it without actually getting into the detail. What they don't realise is that in order to do this distributed ledger at the moment, there's a hell of a lot of electricity going into computers around the world. And he'd calculated, as I recall the number, which is that if there was no mining going on, i.e. the people who are running these ledgers didn't get the free bitcoins at the bottom as well as the transaction fees, then given the volume on the network at the moment, the transaction fee per transaction would be something like $20. And that is technically, as I understand it, because the proof of work is computationally expensive, yeah. Which is what it was designed to do. But when people go around saying, oh, we want blockchain this, blockchain that, well, you better start buying a sort of, a national grid to run these blockchains on.
Yes, or move them all to Iceland where they use geothermal power.
That's a world in itself.
How you reward people for maintaining a blockchain, I think, is a really interesting topic. So Bitcoin is one way of rewarding people. But, there are other kinds of blockchains, other kinds of rewards. money would be an example that springs to mind, which mean that the spectrum of possibilities is really very wide. And I am absolutely not qualified to test the margins of that spectrum, but I have a feeling, and this is why I say to clients, this is one of the areas we've got to keep looking at out the corner of our eye. I have the feeling something disruptive is going to happen there.
Absolutely. Well, I think we're agreeing. So, on a 10, 20-year view, digital currencies and the blockchain thing, I think it's got the greatest potential. In the short term, I think it's just my frustration that you can tell. It's my frustration that the narrative is still stuck with Bitcoin. It's about time we moved on to that. About time to say that, do you know what, that was a fantastic development by Nakamoto. Some brilliant things. Now, there's some issues we need to fix in there, for example, and let's move on to the next version of it. So that's one of my concerns. So moving on to your fifth point.
So the fifth point, which might well be one of the areas where blockchain goes, is the unfortunately named Internet of Things. One of the things that's going to happen to payments in the reasonable medium term is that we'll stop thinking about payments as being all about a person paying another person, a person paying a shop, because there's going to be things paying other things. And the idea that I will delegate the authority to pay for things to my car or something, or we did a project a little while back looking at some security things to do with smart metering, and the idea that you would delegate authority to pay for things to your fridge.
Yeah, it'll fill itself up with milk.
It sounds quite funny, but actually there's a lot of logic to it. I mean, if my fridge has a chip in it, then my fridge is perfectly capable of negotiating with the electricity company as to when it might turn itself on. And if it's rewarded with, some more effective pricing structure around this. I mean, I know this is an example that everybody uses, it's a lazy example, but it's an easy example to understand. You're getting to half-time in the cup final, you know that everybody's going out to put their tea. This is a well-known phenomenon. You get this surge in the grid. Well, at that point, why couldn't the grid say to all the fridges, why don't you switch off for 20 minutes and save a little bit of electricity while everyone's making a cup of tea? No one's fridge is going to fail in 20, and then at the end of the 20 minutes we'll turn it back on. So the idea that you can have smart discussions between things that end up in payments is really, really fascinating. And I have a suspicion that this may be connected with blockchain in some way. And the reason I think that is because it was Eric Schmidt from Google actually who pointed this out as well. I thought I'd thought of it first, but I hadn't. One of the interesting characteristics about the blockchain is that you only have one of things on the blockchain, which is unusual for the digital world. I can make as many copies of Cliff Richard's hit Summer Holiday.
Well, I think that's by design, wasn't it? So when Nakamoto was coming from was the problem with anything on the interweb can be duplicated many times. And if you've got any kind of currency-like thing, you definitely don't want that. So he bent over backwards to ensure.
So, yes, you're exactly right. So a blockchain has only one of anything on it. And that makes it far more analogous to the hilariously entitled real world. So the idea that you can have something that exists in the virtual world which maps one-to-one to the thing in the real world and is managed on the blockchain is really very interesting. The idea that I rent a car and what's actually happening under the hood,
Very good. Did you prepare that one before?
is effectively, there's a coin coming from Avis to me, and that coin contains a key which allows my phone to now open that car. And of course, while I've got that coin in my wallet, nobody else can use that car.
Which is a bit like the old-fashioned single-line railways, where you needed some token to go along the line to stop crashing.
So there's something floating around in this area. So certainly, in terms of we have our own internal hyperlab where we build and try out things to show to clients. I think that's going to be one of the new things coming this year as well. So the Internet of Things has got to the point where everyone can see that it's becoming mainstream.
Well, I think amongst you tech folks, you can all see it's coming mainstream. Amongst the sort of Luddites like me who don't want Samsung TV recording everything I say to my girlfriend on the sofa, there's a sort of Luddite resistance out there. And what the balance of the two will end up at, we don't know yet.
This just takes us back to identity and authentication. But I'm saying, if you're asking what are the things that we're asking clients to look at the corner of that, I think my fifth and final one will be Internet of Things.
I just brought you up on whether it's going to happen this year as opposed to the next few years, which is a detail. Well, that's really very useful, Dave, in terms of your view of the payments, and as I say, you're much, much better placed than I am to talk about it. So my reservations are just these sort of reservations of a man on the street idiot walking along who doesn't quite understand what's going on. Just moving on to consult Hyperion, as you say, you like working with big people like the entire London Underground or the Brazil transport system or something like that. Just on the fintech, what is big? Because some of them are getting big. I mean, Cantox has had its $1 billion party this week, and Currency Cloud has sort of 4 billion per annum. I mean, surely if you've got a few billion, we can pay for you guys.
Without mentioning names, probably the biggest startup we work with at the moment is actually in the identity space rather than the pure payment space. But we do work with a couple of people there. If you're asking what is the stuff that we're working on now,
I'm more offering you sort of free advertising space, really, actually. Or you're just being very polite about your free advertising.
But actually, I think for people in the fintech space, Consult Hyperion is quite a niche consultancy. And I think we're not a statistical sample of IT spending in the industry. We're far too small. But I think we are a weather vane. I mean, people that spend money on us to do the feasibility studies, build the pilots, start designing the systems, start doing the rollout plans, people who spend money on us doing that kind of thing, they wouldn't spend that money unless they were serious about these things. So the stuff that's hot for us right now, I think, is a weather vane for the fintech guys as to where they should be looking at their spending. And I would say the stuff that's really hot for us right now, we have an awful lot of work in transit. Transit is very, very hot at the moment because there's a lot of transit systems around the world that want to do what London have done and start to move away from custom things to what's called open loop solutions. Got a lot of stuff around apps and HCE that goes with that. NFC is big for us. You know, Apple Pay has kind of legitimized that space, caused a lot of spending. We have a lot of work in the tokenization space because behind the scenes, what powers things like Apple Pay is this move to tokenization. That's a big, big spend.
And again, just from an idiot's perspective, as far as I understand it, that's trying to prevent the problem where I've got my MasterCard number, I type it in and anyone can use that.
Correct.
To actually this clever little way where actually per specific thing, I get kind of a different number or a longer number or something like that, basically.
You get a token that you can use. That's actually very big business for us at the moment. We have quite a lot of work in the, what you would probably regard as the boring, dull old, EMV migration, upgrade, contactless, that kind of stuff. That's all moving on quite nicely as well. We've been working with banks and mobile operators recently on responses to identity initiatives in different places. I think one of the difficult things, for some of our clients in that space is that for traditional reasons, banks and mobile operators and people like that see identity in more of a sort of tactical way. They see it as a way of, single sign-on to reduce log-ons or culling card fraud or whatever. Whereas I think some of the people that they're nervous about, Google and Facebook and Apple, have a kind of a more strategic view of identity. And I think, that's actually a pretty interesting area. In fact, as it happens, I'm the little advert here. I'm chairing the identity and authentication stream at the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona next week, and I'm really looking forward to that because this is a hot area for the coming year, I think.
Okay, well, that's been very interesting, Dave, and I can see that you guys cover the whole spectrum from the sort of utility, big, solid stuff at the moment to the more crazier, out there stuff where we're not sure whether it's going to be 5 years, 10 years, or ever at all. And I think, coming back to my theme for fintech as a whole for 2015, if last year was the year of the startup, then I think what I'm seeing in fintech at the moment is that this is the year of the scale-up. And one of the things you need to do in the scale-up journey is become big, solid, and industrial. Because once you're doing billions of everything needs to work.
Yeah, no, it's a mass market business.
Good. So thanks very much, Dave. Very interesting.
Not at all. Thanks very much, Mike.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe on iTunes or your podcast app, or sign up at londonfintechpodcast.com for email alerts of new episodes. Live long and prosper.
We could sit in a band there all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moon ride, watching a happy moon ride. Come away from the city, with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city, with the faces so grey, with the pain of the everyday. We the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? We fade in between the earth and the sky. Kiss the city goodbye. Wave the city goodbye. Wave the city goodbye. Wave the city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me. 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 Watch the firelight